You know, I've seen a lot of weird stuff this week because over the last 4 or 5 days, I've actually been working with Windows Vista, which has been an absolute nightmare. And some of the stuff this OS is doing is just incredible. And all of this is kind of working towards a tech wave that I was hoping to have out today, but hopefully in the future, we'll see how Vista holds up here. It'll make sense then. But alongside of that, something else weird happened, and this has to do with a video that I posted up last weekend when it comes to Apple and emulation and being more official instead of having to jailbreak or sideload stuff. Seemingly Apple opening up to these emulators being on their App Store, which was a massive turnabout from what we're used to with Apple. Well, now it appears an application has actually tested this whole thing with them, and somehow it actually got through and has been approved. And we're going to go over that here today because, well, this application is also not exactly as it appears. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. So let's go over exactly what this is first off, because as I mentioned last weekend, we went over some of the changes in Apple's guidelines for the App Store and what would be approved on their storefront that's official for iPhone, iPad. And emulation came up. They specifically mentioned it, and they seemed to say it was fine, although there were a lot of questions as to how vague some of the terminology was being. But now we have the first retro emulator hitting Apple's App Store, but you should probably avoid it. All right, so let's go over exactly what they mean here. I mean, you can see the emulator, the application here. If we kind of blow that up, I mean, yeah, it looks like what you'd expect from a Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color setup, where you have the screen at the top, and then of course the D-pad, A, B, start select at the bottom there. Okay, now this is, as you see here, iGBA. Okay, GBA and GBC, Game Boy Color Retro Emulator. And in fact, if we look over on the App Store, it is sitting at number 4. Now, this was starting to really blow up on social media as I was getting messages about this, again, while I'm hitting my head against the wall with Vista, over the last 2 days when it seemingly went live and started to pick up steam online. And some were telling me it was as high as just the number 1 slot on the App Store, which is, I mean, it's impressive stuff, and obviously you're going to have a lot of people taking a look at it then, and many online have been posting up them just using this emulator. So, like, over on Retro Dodo, they had a good breakdown and article around this, and even showing some of their own shots using it, and again, it looks like what you'd expect, and in fact, you do actually have ROMs in your files folder on iOS that you point to. So you go to any website that has, we'll say, backups of ROMs, right? Different archives. And as you go through, of course, and pick out the different ROMs, you can give this application permission to go in and load up these different ROMs, and it'll set up sort of in this menu system here, and you pick them alphabetical order, and it'll just start playing. Sound seems to work. The performance is good, and mostly that's because it is not exactly an original emulator, as in whoever posted this thing up on iOS, the App Store, seemed to rip it from GBA for iOS, which is an application that you sideload on your iPhone, as they show here, or your iPad, I guess, and you're off and running. This is one that has been worked on for a while. It's high quality, and it appears the person who then took it and posted it up on the App Store had some other plans in mind, because what they have done seemingly is add in their own advertisements, which that's not uncommon. So if you're on Android and you've downloaded different free emulators, because they're all over the store there, it's not an issue on Android. This is mostly an iOS specific thing, but because there are so many people on iPhones and iPads, there is a massive, massive market there to explore. And in this case, the first real emulator that got through, of course, has advertisements that will play while you're going through your games and that sort of thing. It also has tracking, apparently, which that's another thing people are bringing up and looking at, like, oh, okay, so hold on, they're tracking data. They have ads in there. Again, I don't think any of that's really new for free emulators, but this entire thing is extremely questionable right now. And the person who created GBA for iOS also called this out over on Threads. saying, so apparently Apple approved a knockoff of GBA for iOS, the predecessor to Delta I made in high school in the App Store. I did not give anyone permission to do this, yet it's now sitting at the top of the charts despite being filled with ads and tracking. So, I'm now looking at this thing and wondering what kind of door has this opened? Because I was wondering if we would see different emulators get approved for Apple's App Store, because it did seem like the terminology was like, you can do it, but it's going to have extremely limited functionality. Well, this thing seems to have all the functionality you'd want for an emulator. I mean, you can play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. It pulls directly from your files, and it even will allow you to then link out, and you can it'll help you basically get to different sites from within the app in order to download the ROMs. So it's all kind of there and set up to be a pretty seamless experience without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. And now I'm thinking, okay, this isn't even that person's work necessarily. It's a ripoff of GBA for iOS. Does that mean we could see ripoffs of all kinds of different emulators make its way over and have ads and tracking, that sort of thing, just sort of insert it? Because, I mean, the number of people, I'm sure at this point, if it was at the top of the charts just like a day or two ago, is probably insane. Like, there's so many people, I'm sure, who have downloaded it, have checked it out, and at least fired it up and seen a few ads, which it seems pretty lucrative actually to go this route, which makes the fact that it was approved by Apple very surprising. Like, I did not expect this to happen and actually go through this easily. You feel like there would be at least a little bit more background checking done here for something like this that is immediately testing the limits of these new regulations. So I am wondering if it's going to turn into sort of the Wild West unless Apple sort of clamps down on this entire situation, which may actually end up being bad overall for maybe the original authors of these different emulators who want to just drop them on the App Store. And I know that the idea of charging for these different emulators has come into question with the way Nintendo is moving currently against a lot of these, well, some of these emulators now, but there are certainly ripple effects out there as we have seen some emulators on Android just completely get pulled down when they were previously behind like a $5 paywall. Hey, you want to buy this emulator? It's $5, no ads, nothing like that, and you have access to this emulator that you can play on your phone. And it seemed like people were fine paying that, but now Apple approving this could get interesting, and I kind of feel like it's going to get pulled down in a like. It wouldn't shock me if this week we hear that this emulator just disappears off of the App Store. And it's something to keep an eye on because now someone is actually testing the regulations that have been put in place here by Apple. But I will say on the flip side, if nothing happens here and Apple is just fine with the idea of emulators that can access files you have saved to your phone, maybe we really are there. Maybe we are to a point where emulators can just start appearing on the App Store, and the iPhone, the iPad can be completely opened up to it in a very similar way that Android devices are. And sure, it might be Apple, again, just sort of reacting to a lot of the regulatory stuff that's going on right now that they're facing in the EU and in the US, but, I mean, that would just be good overall for consumers, especially if we have, like GameCube being played on the iPhone, iPad, and PlayStation 2. A lot of cool stuff can happen, and then we can maybe see a focus on those M series chips that seem to punch well above their weight class. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. A sketchy app, sure, but one that's certainly something we should keep our eye on to see how Apple reacts to this in the coming days. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.